Well, let's start with prayer. Please bow your heads. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for such a beautiful setting. We thank you for the information that we have throughout this whole weekend. I've heard the seminars, and the speakers have been just top-notch. And Jesus, I ask that you will be here with us as we go through this topic, because it's a hard one, and it's so important that your kids are safe. So please send your spirit to be with us. We love you. Amen. So I just want to kind of give a little caveat that as we start, statistically, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys will be sexually assaulted before the age of 18. And so just going purely off the numbers, I'm guessing that many people in here have personal knowledge with the topic of abuse that we're going to be covering today. And I really want to invite you to do good self-care as we go through this. This could be triggering to you. It's mostly going to be going through this, but we never know how something like that's just knowledge is going to, talking about the law, is going to intersect our story. And so if you start to notice that your body is unwell with the material that we're going over, feel free to stand up, go out, do what you need to do to care for yourself during this. And if you feel like you need help in that, I can talk after as well. So that is my caveat. So child abuse. Like I said, the statistics are high. You can guarantee that you know children who are being abused, even if you are not aware of it yet. And so it's important for us to know what the signs are, as well as what constitutes abuse as per the law, because all of you in this room, in your capacity as volunteers for Pathfinders, are mandated reporters. So that means by law, if you have a reasonable concern that a child within your purview is being abused in some way, you have 48 hours to report that. If you choose not to, it is a gross misdemeanor if you are caught. So just to put some teeth into it at the beginning, we're not going to dwell there super long. But it really is important that you can recognize it. So we're going to go through the definitions of abuse, and we're going to just kind of walk through what is the process if you have a reasonable concern, what is reasonable concern, and then what happens afterwards. So I am on page 1 at the bottom of your little handout. And I will, I'm going to give it one more caveat, and that is that I spent some quality time on the phone with CPS this week for the purpose of clarifying a few things in this presentation. Not all CPS workers are created equal. You need to know that. So sometimes that means you talk to one and they give you bad information, and then you just call a different county and get better information. Because the first one I talked to, I was asking about statute of limitations. So when you have a child who has been abused, when can you stop reporting it? Meaning that, so like I as a therapist may be working with a 17-year-old and we're working on trauma that happened when she was 5, let's say. Do I have to report that, even though the person's no longer in her life anymore, et cetera, et cetera? The answer is yes. That's hard for me because I would say between 85 and 90% of the people I work with have trauma, sexual trauma, physical trauma, which means I'm going to become really, really good friends with CPS in the next, because I have some things I need to report. And I'm just saying I learned some things this week. I was under the impression that if I didn't have enough data, so unwanted sexual contact amongst adolescents, for example, let's say you have a 16-year-old girl and an 18-year-old boy, where it starts consensual and then ends non-consensual, and thus my client that's something that I have to share with CPS, even if I don't have a last name of the boy. And just, a lot of the examples when I use examples, they will not give any identifying information for sure, but often, because I work mostly with girls, the examples are going to be girls being the victims, boys being the perpetrators, potentially. But I would like to put that out that that's because of the population I work with, not because that is the only thing that happens. Boys can be victims, like I said, every bit as much as girls can. And what's tricky about boy victims is that, or male victims, is that especially if a male was the perpetrator, there is a higher level of shame and a less likelihood to disclose. So, did you have a question? Depends on the age gaps, and I don't have all of them memorized, but for the most part, if a 2-year gap is what from about 14 on, I'm thinking, and if you want the specifics, I can find the RCW for you so you can actually read it. But off the top of my head, if there is sexual contact and there's more than 2 years between the participants, then whether it's considered consensual or not, it gets dicey and gray in that area. So if you have a 14-year-old male and a 16-year-old female, that may or may not be considered consensual, even if they say it's consensual. And the older the younger person gets, the more of an age span there can be legally. Does that make sense? So there's so much more material than we can cover in 52 minutes, just so you know. So if you have, I'm going to try to, I've got a timer going to try to give us about 7 minutes for questions at the end. You're welcome to ask in the middle if you need to. But okay, so the bottom of page 1, recognizing child abuse and neglect. It's important that you have some definitions. Like I said, I'm not going to read this to you. I'm going to give you the cliff notes. So neglect of a child or vulnerable adult, that's important. Again, this is only for children, protecting children, but by law, mandated reporters also have to report if a vulnerable adult is being harmed. And like I said, there's an RCW for that as well. And just, you know, RCW is the legislative codes. They're really boring, and they use a lot of really dumb words. So I'm, like I said, this is a consumer-friendly version of the RCWs. So if you want specific law, I can find that information for you. So negligence. Negligent treatment or maltreatment is when a child is not getting the care that they need. That could mean that food is being withheld. It could mean that medical care is being withheld. It means that there are basic needs that the child has that their caregivers are not providing for them. And so homelessness is not abuse, just to put that out there. However, if in the course of homelessness, certain things aren't happening, then it may mean that the family needs to be reported for the purpose of receiving more services. Because that's one thing, CPS does come in and take children away from families when it is necessary. But at least as per their stated goals, their goal is for family reunification and give resources to families. So just because you make a CPS report does not mean that a child is going to be taken out of a home. When at all possible, they try to add services, add help, in-home help. It could be food resources, that kind of a thing, so that the children have what they need to thrive. So neglect, that's what that is. Turn page, top of number 2. Physical abuse. Physical abuse is, as it says, harming a child. Throwing, kicking, burning, cutting, striking with a closed fist. I found out by making a CPS report about, 14 years ago, that I had an adolescent who had been slapped by her caregiver hard enough that she flew across the room and hit a wall. And CPS took my report and said they couldn't do anything about it because the fist wasn't closed. However, that was not the only thing the caregiver did, and so we were able to get her out of the home. In this case, that was a good thing. So again, that's why there's specifics in here. If you shake a child under the age of 3, obviously, if you interfere with a child's breathing. Threatening with a deadly weapon. These are all things you should not be doing to children. And if you know that a child in your care or one who is, say, in your Pathfinder group, then you need to report that. Sexual abuse, second section, means committing or allowing to be committed any sexual offense against a child. That could be inappropriate touching. That could be, of course, intercourse, any kind of, any violation, anally, orally, vaginally, etc. All of these, obviously, are sexual contact, and it's not your job, just so you know, to figure out if the child is telling the truth. It's if you have reasonable cause and concern. So some of what that means is, does a child know a lot about sexual things that at that age they shouldn't know that much? That's something that you need to report to Child Protective Services. So an example of that would be, I had a client come to me once, many years and et cetera ago, because what the tipping off event was, he was playing games during recess that he shouldn't have had the knowledge to play. He was using specific verbiage he shouldn't have known at the age of 8, unless he'd had contact with things that were above his age group. Does that make sense? And so that's part of what tips us off that, oh, there's something going on here. The kiddo isn't safe. And that's the goal of this whole thing, is our job is to keep kids safe, to help get kids safe if they're not safe. So sexual abuse, it doesn't have to even be an adult to a child. Children abuse other children. And in every instance that I know of, the perpetrating child has had harm done to them, and so they're acting out what they have done, or have had done to them, I should say. But again, it's important that the perpetrating child gets the help they need so they don't take those things into adulthood with them. So again, mandated reporting really is important because it comes down to safety. A newer category is sexual exploitation. So if a child is being used to create pornography or is being sold by anyone for sexual contact, there's a whole task force in our state now specifically to this because of how prevalent it's become with the internet and how easy it is to access. And so obviously that would be considered abuse and we need to report. Negligent treatment and maltreatment. If you have reason to believe that, like I said, a child is being neglected, that's important. Look at letter C under negligent treatment. Poverty, homelessness, or exposure to domestic violence perpetrated against someone other than the child does not, in and of itself, constitute negligent treatment or maltreatment. The times that does not count is if there's reason to believe that the child could be harmed in the course of domestic violence. So if you have reason to believe that the child, like let's say mom is hurting dad in some ways, which does happen, and you have reason to believe the child is going to jump into the situation and try to protect dad, then that would be a time where you would report domestic violence, even though the child isn't technically the one being harmed, because domestic violence does not count as a vulnerable adult. So you're not a mandated reporter for domestic violence unless there's children in the home who are likely or quite possibly in harm's way because of the domestic violence. Let's see, is there anything else into this category that's dreadfully important? I would recommend that you read this material because, like I said, it can't cover all of it. I'm giving you the cliff notes of what is most important. But, yeah, there's a lot more than what we can cover. Obviously, abandonment, if you feel like a child is being abandoned or is living on their own and they're too young, because 15, 16 is too young to live on your own, then it's something that is going to be needing to be reported to Child Services. So middle of page 3, signs and symptoms. This is a little tricky because there are certain seasons of life where children can look abused and they're not. I don't know if this is true of all small children, but when my oldest, who was like a freight train as a young child, was about 3, he looked like I battered him. And then he had a run-in with our rooster, and he really looked like he was a battered child. And I will admit, as a mandated reporter, I came home from work one day and saw he was probably only 2 at that moment, in his high chair, and half of his face was swollen, and there was scratches, and my first thought was, what did Richie do to him? Because, I mean, when you just walk in and see your child slightly beaten, and I'm like, what happened? And he's like, the rooster came at him and just slapped him upside the head, for reals. And and if we didn't have the meanest rooster on the face of the earth, I wouldn't have believed that, for the record. But for a while, Caleb, if you had just looked at him, he had bruises and stuff all over his legs and his arms because he played so hard. But that is a very small and transitory time period. And do the examples that the child gives sound feasible and plausible? If you would have asked Caleb, which I did, honey, what happened to your face? Oh, mama, it was the rooster, and he came, and he gave me this long, drawn-out story. Okay, 2-year-olds are not going to come up with long, drawn-out stories that aren't true like that. So it's important to ask questions, not, did your mother do that to you? Because that's a leading question. That's never our job. But it's very important to be curious when you have a child that you're concerned could be that they're exhibiting some of the signs here. You can say, hey, I'm noticing that you have bruises on your upper arm. Can you tell me about that? Watch their demeanor. Do they get really cagey on you? Do they kind of, start moving their body away from you? Because if they really did just fall down the stairs, they're probably not going to try to get out of the conversation with you. If they're trying to keep the conversation really, really short so that they don't expose more than they mean to, then okay, that's something that you need to make a mental check that there's something off here. And what's tricky is on some of these things, you have to use your own judgment on when have they created reasonable concern in your mind that something now needs to be reported. Does that make sense? So, when in doubt, talk to someone in your Pathfinder group. Talk to your director. Call Richie at the conference office. Goodness knows he has a lot of experience in this at this point. So say, hey, I'm seeing this. Is that enough to report? The other thing you can do, and I've even had to do this as a therapist, you can call CPS and not give your name and say, hey, I have a child within my care as a volunteer who's exhibiting these things. Is that something that I need to report? They will almost always say yes, but I have had one time that they said, no, you don't have enough information to make it worthwhile. But you are allowed to talk anonymously and just ask questions. And I've even had a time where I asked questions anonymously, and they're like, okay, so you do need to report this. I'm like, okay, I will report this, but I'm still within my 48-hour window, and the child was not in imminent harm, for the record. I said, I will call back in a few hours. I'm going to get a little bit more information and make sure a few things are in place before we make this call. You do have a little bit of flexibility within your 48-hour window. But if you feel like a child is in imminent harm, like tonight, then you need to not wait those 48 hours. You need to make your report faster than that. So we're still on page 3. Some of the signs and symptoms of a child who could be being abused or neglected. Sudden changes in behavior and school performance. They have been harmed in some way. Let's say there was an accident, but they didn't get the medical care that they should have had based off of that. They're hypervigilant. They lack supervision. Again, some things you have to take into consideration, though, here is culture a little bit. I think about half the children in the town I live in lack supervision. It's a small town. People don't watch their children in Fairfield. I don't know why that is. But it is not uncommon to have small gangs of very nice children at the park, and there is no grown-up anywhere. I don't know if they're in a house watching out a window. I don't know. My children are supervised. Well, unless they're in the middle of a field, then they're not. But they have to stay within sight of the house. Otherwise, they have to take a radio. See, so there is still a level of supervision that happens. But again, so culture matters. A child who constantly shows self-loathing, self-hatred, that's something that you kind of put a little check mark in your head, because I don't think children naturally hate themselves. And so if you have a child who constantly says, I'm just awful, I'm just worthless, again, you don't call CPS because they feel like they're worthless, but you get really curious about some other things, so that when you have opportunities, you can ask good questions. Yeah, I'll just let you read the rest of that because often you may not have as much contact with the parent as with the child. Consider the possibility of physical abuse when, as we said earlier, the child cannot give a very good example of bites, burns, bruises, broken bones, black eyes. They have harm. Their person has been hurt in some way. It really could be they fell out of a tree. Caleb fell out of a tree when he was 3, and he did have marks from that fall because 3-year-olds shouldn't be 10 feet up in a tree, just so you know. But they move so fast sometimes, even when you're standing right there. So my eldest has really given me a run for my money. So thankfully, he's almost 13, and I think we're out of that window permanently. So consider the possibility of neglect when. Does the child hoard or guard food? Do they have frequent absences to school? Again, do they need medical care, dental care, that kind of a thing, but they just can't get it? And they, again, cagey. Is the child cagey with you when you're curious about these things? Because that would suggest that there's more going on that perhaps, you need to be curious about. That's the word I really want you to take away from this is, can you be curious? If there's something that just feels off right here in your gut, you never come in and say, are you being abused? Because the answer is almost always going to be no. But if you can be curious and ask open-ended questions, things like, hey, can you tell me about this? If you're concerned they don't have supervision at home, the kind of questions you can ask, so tell me what your weekends look like. Tell me what it looks like when you get off school for the afternoon. The worst thing that could happen from those kind of things is you get to know your kids better. And if they are being left alone for inordinate amounts of time, because again, 8-year-olds shouldn't be left alone for inordinate amount of times. Again, now by the time you hit 12, 13, you can spend a period of time at home by yourself, and it's not abuse. It's called freedom. But again, that's where you take the situation and the mental capacity and functioning of the child into consideration as you're asking some of these questions. Consider the possibility of sexual abuse, middle of page 4. Does the child have difficulty walking, sitting? They're having changes around the physical activities they're willing to engage in. If they report nightmares, bedwetting. Again, a child who has nightmares isn't necessarily being sexually abused, but that's again where you get curious. If you're starting to hear them say certain things, let's be curious about what other things could be going. And that's why it's helpful to keep this, because if they say one thing, they're like, uh-oh, that feels off. You can go back and look at some of the other categories and go, do they have some of those other categories? And it could help you be creative in your curious questioning, if that makes sense. So if they say, oh my goodness, I'm having nightmares like every night, let's say they're coming into Pathfinders really tired, then you could ask something like, hey, are you watching too many movies, eating too many Cheetos, right before bed, that kind of thing. And they say, no, I'm just having all these nightmares. Oh, and And you're thinking, oh, that's important. Lots and lots of nightmares matters. But again, everyone has nightmares. I'm guessing, have all of you in this room had a nightmare or 5? Yeah, exactly. So that doesn't mean that you fall into the categories on this list. But combined with some of the other things on here, it may mean that there's something unsafe for the kiddo that you're dealing with. So you can go back and like read some of these categories and go, okay, they have nightmares. Do they have these other things? You know, do they have fading bruises? Do they have, you know, a lot of injuries? Do they have changes in appetite? You're noticing that they used to eat a whole bunch and now they barely will eat any of their food. I mean, again, these are things that just says that you need to be curious, because some of these things, depression has some of these similar categories. Drug use has some of these similar categories. And don't think that 10-year-olds don't have access to drugs. So, I mean, again, that's why curiosity really matters, because we want to be able to give good care to the kids that we have. We're going to go down to the middle of page 5, corporal punishment. It is not illegal to spank your child. I had someone once tell me that it was, and I'm like, uh-oh. I have spanked my child. I can say I've never spanked them to the place where it left a mark. I mean, there's the, you know, there might be red for like, I've never timed it, a very short amount of time. But there should not be lasting results of a spanking. Spankings or other discipline should never happen with a closed fist. Slapping a child's face or head injuries, that's not what corporal punishment looks like. And so if a child reports that, yeah, my mom gets really, really mad at me and she slaps me around the room. Okay, technically it's not a closed fist, but it's also not an okay way to punish a child, to give direction to a child. So the second paragraph under corporal punishment, the following actions are presumed unreasonable when used to correct or restrain a child. Throwing, kicking, burning, cutting, striking a child with a closed fist. Again, all these things that are under the category of physical abuse are in there. You also need to take into consideration, is it excessive to the what the child has done? So if the child, you know, is 5 and was excited about something and they yelled and woke up their sibling, for example, and, you know, the parent's response was to chase the child around the house, spanking them, that's an excessive consequence for the infraction. So again, curiosity matters. Your goal isn't to prove if something happened or not, but you do need to get enough information about the situation. So asking about the child's experience, not did they do that to you? Can you hear the difference between those two kind of questions? What have we not covered that's very important? If a parent is on drugs, that is not considered a reportable thing unless their drug use is leading to negligence, which it usually does. But again, just the fact that mom is on drugs, unless she's pregnant, and that because the child doesn't have a say on if they have drugs in their system, so that is considered prenatal endangerment. So where are we for time? Oh, we're doing pretty well, actually. Does anyone have any questions before we move on? Please. Yeah, because I mean, I wouldn't say as a mother I've ever said to my child, I need you to not answer any questions except for around birthday presents. That's the only category that we keep secrets in our household. And so I would find it concerning if a child responded to me with, I'm not supposed to answer any questions. And just I'm getting the feeling that you have some concerns for this child already, and I'm guessing there's some hunches somewhere. And sometimes you just feel it in your guts. And I don't even know how to put something specific on that, but sometimes you interact with a child and you just go, there's something very wrong here. And that's the kind of thing we all have to use our judgment on when it's crossed the line that we have to report. Because especially if a child isn't coming in with black eyes and broken bones, where it's the obvious, okay. I had a situation, and I wish I had handled it differently. I was 21, and I didn't know better. Like, I knew in my gut something wasn't right. I was doing a day camp with the church that we were pastoring, and I was the oldest and in charge. 21 might not quite be old enough to do that, I've decided. I ran a really good program, but there was one thing. There was a mom who asked us to, if her 4-year-old could join. Technically, we were 5 and up, school age, but she's like, she's really good, she'll stay with her brother. And I'm like, sure, yeah, we're a little low on our numbers this week, so I can put her in with a girls group, won't be a big deal. We were only running, about 30, 35 kids with our day camp. And, mom would drop her off, mom would pick her up. Both parents were married, lived together. And one day, Daddy came to pick her up, and she ended up being with us for about 3 weeks, her and her brother. And she, when Daddy came, she grabbed onto me, no, please, I don't want to go home with Daddy. And in my head, how I reasoned it, which was wrong, by the way, was, well, they live together. I mean, it's not like their parents are separated, so I guess she's just having a lot of fun at day camp, which she was. But there's that thing right here that just said, it's not okay. So the next day, she came, and we were hanging out, and depending on the activities, she might be my shadow for the day, helping me with stuff, that kind of a thing. And so I said, hey, I noticed you were pretty upset yesterday when it was time to go. And she wouldn't engage. She would not even kind of go there at all. And so I just kind of let it go, and a few days later, it happened again. And so I just kind of mentioned to her brother, who was a lot older than her. She was 4 and he was 10 or 11. And I'm like, hey, I noticed she's not really keen to go home with Dad. He's like, yeah, she just gets like that sometimes. Sometimes she picks Daddy and doesn't want Mommy, and sometimes she picks Mommy and doesn't want Daddy. And I let it go. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what I should have done, to be entirely honest. But I wish I had done more than I did. If it was now, but again, I have a degree in these things now. I didn't know, I knew that something felt off. But I think that's where, actually, here's what I should have done differently. I should have talked to someone else who was older than me. That's what I should have done. And say, hey, I have this gut feeling, and this is the child's behavior. Brother is completely glossing over it. What should I do? And so I did not violate the law, and I don't think I did as well by that child as I wish I had. Because what could it, if there was harm being done by her father, then it could have changed her life at 4 rather than at, say, 10. See, I think there's wisdom in getting input from wise others. Respecting confidentiality really matters, especially, I know do most of us in this room live in small communities? So confidentiality really matters. Pick who you need to talk to wisely. You can always talk to Richie. And if you want to just think it out loud and see, is this something you need to report? Because I think that there is wisdom in numbers, not large numbers, but in having a small group. And I'll get a question in just a sec. One of the things I ran into when we were pastoring in Pendleton is Pendleton is a small town. And the one time we had to call CPS when we were in Pendleton for one of the kids in our youth group, didn't realize it until she answered the phone, called our head elder's wife. Cool, not cool. You don't want, what happens, if you have concerns, you don't want to become a church matter. You want it to be a private matter because this child and possibly their family worship in your church. And you don't know yet, because it's not your job to figure out the truth of all this, you don't want it to go somewhere within the church community. You want it to stay small and let either law enforcement or CPS take care of it. That's the other thing, and then I really will get to your question. This is my stream of consciousness. But you have options on who you report to. You can report to CPS or you can report to law enforcement. Law enforcement may tell you to call CPS, but if you're in a small town and you have concerns about CPS, you can start with law enforcement. That's sometimes helpful. Your question, sir. One of the things I learned this week, I think I started down this track at the beginning, but I didn't finish my thought, that I'm going to be processing myself as a mandated reporter, is I have instances with some of the girls that I see where something started consensual, but it didn't end consensual. And so, what do you do in those kind of situations? And I asked the CPS person, I asked both of them, and the first one didn't give me good information. Second one, King County, I really felt like had a better worker on than Spokane County did this last week. I asked her, what do you do in those kind of situations? And she said, you still need to report it. I'm like, that's tricky. I said, I don't have the information of the other person, and I don't even know if the girl has the last name of the person that she was interacting with. And they said that it still needs to be reported because even if they can't follow up on it, if there might already be a file open for the child, because if there's a pattern of this where the parents are not protecting the child and she's getting into these kind of situations repetitively, that might be a place where they step in and offer more support to the family. And it might be parenting classes, it could be, they've got a whole list of things that they can do. But that was a surprise to me. Like I said, I'm gonna have to mull this and figure out what my clinical judgment says, because I don't wanna call them every week. And I also, yeah, you're smiling. Yeah, I also want my clients to be able to talk to me without fear that I'm going to be reporting every intimate detail of our sessions so like I said, I'm gonna have to think and process about this because that was new information to me. I mean, I know all of these categories, but some of this area really is gray. And it's not straightforward. That's why talking to CPS and processing it with them. You can always not hang up impolitely, but and just get a different worker too. Because sometimes a different worker you can just kind of feel that they're gonna be able to think and process with you in a way. That's why I said I called the first one, and she sounded like a Valley girl, like totally. And I'm thinking, oh, have mercy. And she gave me information. I was willing to go with it until she said one thing. I mean, I said, when is the statute of limitations? And she said, well, there is none. I'm like, what? And she's like, I had someone report last week, a therapist, who reported someone who was talking about, they were 60 years old, 60, and talking about abuse by their mother when they were a child and the mother is deceased. And I thought, then it's true, I just need my own worker then, because all of my clients have something somewhere that's reportable. And I'm like, that's the law? And she said, absolutely. And I said, can you tell me the RCW that corresponds with that statement? And she's like, of course. And she gave me one, and it said the exact opposite of what she had just said. And I said, thank you so much for your information. And I hung up, and I called a different county so that I could just talk to someone different. And that person clearly had been doing the job a little longer and was really just more logical in their answers. So, did you have a question? That's an important question. I think, if there's either work in threes, whether it be 2 kids, 1 adult, 2 adults, 1 kid, I think that's important. If you feel like you need to have follow-up questions with a child about something maybe you're concerned about, that might be a good time to bring in another adult, just so there's a witness, as well as so that there is both a witness for what's happening, as well as a witness for what the child is saying. It's true. I think that's one of those times, again, safety in numbers. And so if you have, at least in our Pathfinder group, there's really never a time where a counselor and a kid is off in another part of the building. Not that we have a large building, but usually it's the kids and the counselor, kids plural. Even if there's discipline, it's you go off to the side of the room, everyone is still over here, so there's never a question, of alone time, that kind of thing. The reality is most kids, if you ask them a question like, hey, tell me about your afternoon, what does your time look like, that kind of a thing, most kids aren't going to take that weird. And if you are concerned, document. That's something we haven't talked about yet, but documentation is your best friend on these kind of things. So let's say if you have a concern about a child, they had bruises that they didn't feel, that's too big of a one. Let's say something not quite that. Stop. That's my timer, so I know to make sure to give you all time for questions. Let's say you have like that gut feeling and there's that little thing that happened. Write it down, let your director know, I'm documenting this child, here's the things that I'm documenting. Yes? You just have to go with it in the sense of, maybe try to spend more time with that child, give them opportunities to be with you. You can't call CPS and just say, I have this gut feeling. That's good and bad. I've had clients that I've worked with, as their therapist, where I've had a gut feeling that there's a lot more that they're not telling me, especially when I was working with kids. I can't report gut feelings. I just have to be available so that if they want to share, they can. Yes, sir. As I have read the law, which I've done a fair bit this last week in preparation for this, technically, the answer is no, because you're not working within your capacity as a volunteer for a nonprofit, and I'm assuming you're not being paid to do this service work. That's something they call permissive reporting, so you're not necessarily mandated as per your job. I'm of the opinion that if you see something that blatant, I would recommend reporting it. Because there's the law, which is a gross misdemeanor if you are mandated to report and you don't do it. But then there's the moral obligation of, diapers not being changed for long periods of time create sores. And this is harm that a child can't fix that. There's nothing they can, nor should they. And so there's the moral obligation. Our goal is to keep kids safe. Our goal is to, clearly that family needs more help. Because I would say most adults are not trying to harm their children. They are overwhelmed. Most parents aren't evil. I've only interacted with a very small amount, one or two parents who I truly walked away and said, I think they're evil. I think they may have given their soul over to Satan. And I'm not saying that with any sarcasm. There's sometimes you just get this feel off this person that there is something very, very wrong with them. And so, I've worked at a homeless shelter for women and children. I've worked with a lot of families who need a lot of services. Even the moms who are drug addicted. Some of them, I had one mama, I was working with her and her kids together in a therapeutic setting, and she's like, I never do my drugs in front of my kids. I only do them after they're in bed, because she didn't want to hurt her kids. And once she's high, she can't give good care, and they were little, so they'd wake up in the night, and she was doing the absolute best that she could, and it wasn't good enough. And I think that that's important to bring into this. Our goal is not to vilify parents. Our goal is to keep kids safe. And usually going into this, we can assume the parents are doing the best that they can. That is not always the case. But I would say, I don't know, do you have a number? I would say 95% of the parents that I've worked with, at least, they're doing the best they can, and it's just not good enough. I don't know if you'd throw in a different number. You've worked in different settings. Yes. Well, and I don't primarily work with addiction. That's something I did a little bit when I was working at the homeless shelter. I haven't worked in addiction really at all since I've been in private practice, which has been the last 10 years. So that's not my primary population. But again, once substances get involved, everything gets more complicated. Yes, ma'am, it's true. And that's where what you're reporting is reasonable cause. Again, it's not your job to figure out exactly what happened. In fact, don't try to say, well, what happened next? And then what did he do? And then how did she respond? That's not your area. You're not a forensic interviewer. And the last thing you want to do is taint how they tell the story. You want to leave someone who's an expert to do the interviewing. If you have reasonable cause for concern, that's what you report. So we have about 3 more minutes. Do I have any other questions? Yes, sir.
There's a 15-year-old boy and a 19-year-old girl who wanted to be a counselor, and they started dating. So, I knew they were spending time alone together in a house. So I decided to call CPS, and they said, well, how do you know they're having sex? And I said, well, I don't, but they're dating, so maybe all I'm doing is reporting today. So I didn't know what to do, so I just called CPS,
And that is the kind of thing that you have to report, because again, that's one of those things, again, I would say that's a gray area, because you don't know if they're having sex. You also don't know the level of the power differential is quite a bit. If you have you said a 19-year-old boy, girl, okay. Either way, 4 years is a really big difference at this age. It's not as much in your 20s. And so you don't know what level of coercion, even though it looks like they're dating and consensual. And so the other thing is, where are the parents of these two? Especially the younger one. That's actually, you're less reporting they're having sex and more reporting this 15-year-old doesn't have supervision. And they can be at home by themselves. They can watch their siblings. That's not illegal. But with a girlfriend that much older, there is cause for concern. So I think, as per the law, from everything I've read, that seems like the correct choice. Please.
So Timi gave an amazing presentation, because it's good to hear it from her perspective as a counselor, and then for you to relate to that, or all of us to relate to that as directors or staff members. Some important things that I think you guys probably would want to hear, being in the audience, is that not everything screens in. If you call it into intake, and intake listens to your information that you share, a lot of counselors get very frustrated, I hear, because something didn't screen in. It didn't get addressed. It wasn't investigated. And so we have a screening process that, not we, because I'm not the one who takes the calls. The people who take the calls are trained, and they have a flow chart, and they determine how much whether it's risk or it's just it's a threat, and how quickly we need to respond at CPS. There's that piece of it. You can share with them, I want to make sure that my name stays confidential. This is my name and this is my role, but I want to stay confidential, and they will keep that confidential, and they almost always keep it confidential anyway. Because other people can report. There could be people at school that see the kids, and they'll report, and so the families may not know who shared that information. The last piece is, sometimes you're a piece of a small puzzle. That's one thing about the stigma of CPS, is people don't know the big picture, and CPS has a lot of information. It was real surprising to learn how much. And that said, sometimes you're a piece, that report, maybe nothing happens for 2 years, but then some more intakes come in on the family, and you start seeing trends. Even though they screened out, you could still see trends. And if it screens out, the family's not going to get contacted. So I thought I'd add that piece.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because our goal is, sometimes they're just trying to look for a comprehensive view of the family, and so the screening out means that they, something is put in, but no action is taken on it. But that doesn't mean they just throw it away. They usually don't. They put it into some kind of a file of sorts to see, because if one thing may screen out, 5 things may screen out, but then on the 6th, there's a trend, and so what you do matters. One more thought before we go, because I am going to dismiss you momentarily, is this is online. That's where I got it. And so if you want to give it to your junior counselors, your staff, that kind of a thing, have them read it. Really recommend it. All your staff do need to be knowledgeable on this as per the law. So with that fun, exciting, where we started, and if you don't, it's a gross misdemeanor. Have a very blessed day.